Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty cool story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. So get cozy, enjoy it, and watch it till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Across 1,000,000 worlds, humanity fights for survival against horrors beyond imagination. And standing between mankind and extinction are the Space Marines, the Adeptus Astartes, the Emperor's Angels of Death. These transhuman warriors are faster, stronger, and more resilient than any normal human could ever hope to be. They know no fear. They need little sleep. They can survive wounds that would kill a dozen men, but they were not born this way. They were made. And the story of how the Emperor of Mankind created these superhuman warriors is one of brilliance, sacrifice, and terrible choices that would shape the fate of the galaxy for 10,000 years. This is the story of how Space Marines came to be. Not just the rituals of implantation that transform a young aspirant into an armored giant, but the long and often dark road that led to their creation. A road that began with a different breed of warrior entirely, one whose fate would serve as both inspiration and warning. A road that required the Emperor to reach into the very fabric of reality itself, to blend science with something far more ancient and unknowable. This is a story of genetic mastery, of 20 sons who would become legends, and of the price that had to be paid to forge the perfect weapon for an imperfect war. Before there were Space Marines, before the Great Crusade that would reunite the scattered worlds of humanity, there was only terror, and terror was dying. The planet that had once been humanity's shining cradle, the world from which mankind had reached out to touch the stars, had become a nightmare of ash and blood. The age of strife, that terrible epoch when the storms of the warp had isolated human worlds from one another for thousands of years, had not been kind to the homeworld of humanity. Where once there had been gleaming spires and wonders of technology, now there were only ruins inhabited by savage techno-barbarians, gene cults, and warlords who commanded armies of mutants and monsters. The Emperor of Mankind had walked among humanity for tens of thousands of years, guiding from the shadows, watching and waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. He had seen civilizations rise and fall. He had witnessed humanity's greatest triumphs and its most devastating failures. And now, at the end of the Age of Strife, as reality itself began to stabilize following the birth of the Chaos God Slaanesh, he knew the time had come to act directly. No longer would he guide from behind the scenes. No longer would he allow humanity to stumble through the darkness alone. The species was on the brink of extinction, torn apart by internal strife and external threats, and without intervention, there would soon be nothing left to save. But the Emperor understood something fundamental about the galaxy into which humanity had expanded. It was not a place for ordinary men and women to conquer. The threats that lurked, in the darkness between the stars, the Xenos races that viewed humanity as prey or competition, the demonic entities that dwelled in the warp and hungered for human souls, these were not enemies that could be defeated by conventional armies alone. Even with the most advanced technology humanity had ever produced, even with the determination and courage that defined the species at its best, normal humans would not be enough. The Emperor needed something more. He needed warriors who could stand against any foe, who could endure any hardship, who could carry the banner of humanity into the most hostile environments imaginable and emerge victorious. And so, in the gene laboratories, deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, in facilities hidden far below what would one day become the Imperial Palace, the Emperor began his work. He had spent millennia studying genetics, understanding the building blocks of life itself with a precision that no other being could match. He had access to knowledge from the dark age of technology, that golden era when humanity's scientific prowess had reached heights that would never be equaled again. And he had something more, something that set him apart from every scientist and gene writer who had ever lived. He had his own unique genetic code, the DNA of a being who was far more than human, a template from which something extraordinary could be forged. The Emperor's vision was grand in scope. He would create transhuman warriors, beings who transcended the limitations of baseline humanity while retaining their essential connection to the species they would protect. These warriors would be faster than any Olympic sprinter, stronger than any weightlifter, more resilient than any soldier who had ever lived. They would heal from wounds in hours that would take normal humans weeks or months to recover from. They would be able to fight without rest, to survive in environments that would kill unaugmented humans in moments, to face horrors that would break the minds of ordinary men and remain unshaken. They would be, in every measurable way, superior to the humans they defended. And yet, they would still be human, still connected to the species from which they came, still capable of understanding what they fought for and why it mattered. But creating such warriors was not a simple matter of genetic engineering. The Emperor had attempted similar projects before, each iteration teaching him valuable lessons about what worked and what did not. The path to the perfect transhuman warrior would be long and marked by both triumph and tragedy. It would require multiple attempts, each building upon the last, each revealing new challenges that had to be overcome, and it would demand sacrifices that even the Emperor, for all his power and foresight, might have preferred to avoid. The first step on this road was not the Space Marines at all. It was something cruder, more brutal, but necessary for the task at hand. The Emperor needed to unite Terra, to bring all the warring factions of humanity's homeworld under a single banner before he could even think about expanding into the stars. And for that immediate purpose, he needed soldiers who could crush the armies of the techno-barbarian warlords, who could break the power of the gene cults and mutant kings, who could inspire fear in the hearts of those who would resist unification. He needed warriors who were strong enough and fast enough to win the wars of Terra, even if they were not perfected enough to wage the wars of the galaxy. He needed the Thunder Warriors. In the late 29th millennium, as the Age of Strife began its final violent twilight, the Emperor emerged from the shadows and revealed himself to the people of Terra. He did not come alone. Beside him marched an army unlike any the shattered world had ever seen. These were the Thunder Warriors, the Legiones Categis, the first of the Emperor's transhuman creations, and they were terrifying to behold. The Thunder Warriors were giants among men, standing well over 7 feet tall in their Mark I Thunder Power armor. They were physically stronger than the Space Marines, who would eventually replace them, capable of feats of raw power that defied belief. A single Thunder Warrior could tear through a squad of normal soldiers like a scythe through wheat, his enhanced muscles driving his weapons with bone-shattering force, his augmented skeleton absorbing impacts that would pulverize an ordinary human. They felt little pain, knew less fear, and fought with a savage fury that broke enemy formations before the battle was even truly joined. When the Thunder Warriors marched to war, beneath the banner of the lightning bolt, beneath the icon of the Raptor Imperialis that would become the symbol of unity, their enemies knew despair. The Emperor had created these warriors using techniques that were advanced beyond anything the techno-barbarian warlords could match, but crude compared to what he would later achieve. The Thunder Warriors were not created from adolescents, as the Space Marines would be, but from adult volunteers, men who had sworn loyalty to the Emperor's cause and who were willing to undergo the transformation. The process was rapid, far faster than the careful, staged implantation that would characterize the creation of a Space Marine. It involved alchemical augmentation, somatic gene sculpting, and muscle grafting, techniques that restructured the human body at a fundamental level, but did so with a brutal efficiency that prioritized speed over stability. And that lack of stability would prove to be the Thunder Warriors' ultimate undoing. The enhancements that made them so formidable in combat came with a terrible price. Their bodies, altered too quickly and too radically from their adult baseline, struggled to maintain the changes. Many Thunder Warriors suffered from metabolic collapse, their enhanced organs failing as their systems could not sustain the demands placed upon them. Others experienced mental instability, the aggression that made them such effective killers growing unchecked until it consumed their rational thought. Some descended into psychosis, their minds fragmenting under the strain of what had been done to them. And even those who avoided these fates found that their lifespans were dramatically shortened. A Thunder Warrior might have a decade or two of service before his body began to fail. Some had even less. But for the Unification Wars, they were exactly what the Emperor needed. Terra's warlords commanded vast armies, controlled powerful weapons from the dark age of technology, and ruled over populations that numbered in the billions. Some, like the Pan-Pacific tyrant Nathan Doom, wielded hordes of gene-altered soldiers and psychic abominations. Others, like Callaghan of Ursh, commanded dark powers drawn from the warp itself. The forces arrayed against the Emperor were formidable, and conventional military campaigns, even with superior technology, would have taken centuries and cost countless lives. The Thunder Warriors changed that equation entirely. When the Thunder Warriors struck, they struck with overwhelming force. During the Battle of Moorland Sen, they crushed the Nordic-based confederacy, which had been unknowingly serving the Dark Gods through cannibalistic sacrifice and forbidden genetic manipulation. At the siege of the Ethnarchy's strongholds, they carved through defenses that had withstood previous Imperial assaults, costing 20,000 Thunder Warrior lives and 1 million other casualties. In the conquest of the Pan-Pacific Empire, they broke armies that had seemed unbreakable, and in battle after battle across the war-torn surface of Terra, they proved that transhuman warriors, when properly deployed, could change the course of history. The Thunder Warriors were organized into 20 regiments, each commanded by a Primarch, though these leaders bore no relation to the Primarchs who would later come to lead the Space Marine Legions. These were simply the most skilled and stable of the Thunder Warriors, warriors who had retained more of their mental acuity and tactical thinking despite the transformation. Leaders like Arik Taranis, known as the Lightning Bearer, became legends among both allies and enemies, figures who embodied the terrible might of the Emperor's vision. But the Emperor knew, even as his Thunder Warriors conquered Terra, that they were not the final answer. They were too unstable, too short-lived, too prone to the very flaws that made them effective in the brutal combat of the Unification Wars, but unsuitable for the long campaign he envisioned. When Terra was finally united, when the last of the techno-barbarian kingdoms fell, and the Emperor stood as the undisputed master of humanity's homeworld, he would need warriors who could sustain a galactic crusade that might last centuries. He would need soldiers who could not only fight, but also govern, who could not only conquer, but also build. The Thunder Warriors, for all their savage glory, could never be those soldiers. And so, even as the Thunder Warriors waged the final campaigns of the Unification Wars, the Emperor was already working on their replacement. Deep in his gene laboratories, surrounded by the finest gene wrights and bioscientists Terra could offer, he began a project that would dwarf anything that had come before. He began to create his sons. He began the Primarch Project. The creation of the Primarchs represented the pinnacle of the Emperor's genetic mastery. These were not to be simple super soldiers, however enhanced. The Primarchs were designed to be something far more extraordinary. They would be generals, statesmen, warriors, and leaders, each one a being of such power and charisma that they could command the loyalty of hundreds of thousands of warriors. They would be nearly immortal, resistant to disease and poison, capable of healing from wounds that would kill even a Thunder Warrior. And most importantly, they would be genetically stable, their enhancements integrated so perfectly into their biology that they would not degrade over time. They would be the Emperor's proconsuls, his chosen commanders in the great work of reuniting humanity across the galaxy. The process of creating the Primarchs was staggeringly complex, drawing upon knowledge that even the greatest gene scientists of later ages would struggle to comprehend. The Emperor began with his own genetic code. the DNA of a being who had existed for tens of thousands of years, who possessed psychic power beyond measure, who was in many ways more than human. This served as the foundation, the base template from which everything else would be built. But the Emperor did not simply clone himself 20 times. Each Primarch was to be unique, embodying different aspects of what humanity could become, different strengths and abilities that would complement each other in the great undertaking ahead. The first stage of the Primarch project involved extracting a subset of the Emperor's DNA to create a pure, undifferentiated Primarch gene stock template. This genetic material was then carefully modified and enhanced, with certain sequences strengthened and others altered to produce specific traits. Some of these modifications were purely biological, changes to muscle structure, bone density, neural pathways, and organ function that would make the Primarchs physically superior to any being that had ever lived. Other modifications went deeper, touching upon the Primarch's connection to the warp itself. The Emperor used arcane techniques, knowledge that blended science with something far older and more mysterious, to ensure that his sons would be spiritually as well as physically engineered. This spiritual engineering gave the Primarchs their extraordinary charisma and presence. A normal human encountering a Primarch would feel the weight of that being's existence, the sense that they were in the presence of something greater than themselves. Even other transhuman warriors, even space marines, who themselves towered above normal humanity, would feel that pull, that instinctive recognition that the Primarch was their superior. This was not mere physical intimidation. It was something woven into the very essence of what the Primarchs were, a quality that made them natural leaders, beings whom others would follow even unto death. But this spiritual aspect also made the Primarchs vulnerable in ways that purely physical beings would not be. Their souls shone brightly in the warp, beacons of power that could be sensed across vast distances. And the dark entities that dwelled in that realm, the Chaos Gods, who sought to corrupt and destroy all that the Emperor built, took notice of these bright souls. They saw the Primarchs as both threat and opportunity. If these beings could be corrupted, turned from the Emperor's purpose, they could become the instruments of humanity's downfall rather than its salvation. The Emperor knew this danger and took elaborate precautions. Each of the 20 gestation capsules that held the developing Primarchs was inscribed with powerful protective runes, wards against the influence of chaos that drew upon the Emperor's own mastery of psychic power. The gene vault deep beneath the Imperial Palace, where the Primarchs matured, was surrounded by the most powerful Geller field ever created, a bubble of reality that held the warp at bay. And the Emperor himself maintained constant vigil, his attention never wavering from his developing sons. It was not enough. The Chaos Gods, working in concert, perhaps for the first time in their existence, struck at the Primarch project directly. Some accounts suggest they had help, that the perpetual Erda, who had aided the Emperor in creating the Primarchs and whom the Emperor had called the mother of his sons, opened a warp, vortex in a misguided attempt to save the infants from the fate she believed the Emperor had planned for them. Other sources hint that the Chaos Gods manipulated events through intermediaries, that servants of the dark powers breached the defenses of the gene vault and sabotaged the Geller field generators. The truth may never be fully known. What matters is the result. In a single catastrophic moment, the protective wards failed. A warp vortex opened within the gene vault, and before the Emperor could react, the 20 gestation capsules containing his infant sons were torn from their cradles and scattered across the galaxy. The Emperor's scream of rage and anguish was said to echo across terror, a psychic shockwave that drove those sensitive to such things to their knees. In one terrible instant, the cornerstone of his plan for humanity's future had been ripped away. His sons, whom he had crafted with such care, whom he had invested with such power and purpose, were gone, lost too, the warp and cast to unknown fates on distant worlds. For a lesser being, this might have meant the end of all hope. The Primarchs had taken years to create, and the knowledge required to make them could not be easily replicated. Each one had been unique, a singular work of genetic artistry that combined science and warpcraft in ways that could not be mass-produced. To lose them seemed like an insurmountable setback, a blow from which the Emperor's grand vision could never recover. But the Emperor had not survived for 30,000 years, had not guided humanity through its darkest hours by allowing himself to despair when faced with disaster. He adapted. The Emperor could sense that his sons still lived, that their essences persisted somewhere in the vastness of the galaxy. The gestation capsules had protected them from the warp's worst effects, and whatever worlds they had landed upon, the Primarchs had survived their impossible journey. They were out there, growing, developing, becoming the leaders they were meant to be, but doing so on alien worlds rather than at their father's side. And while the Emperor could not reach them immediately, while the warp storms that still troubled the galaxy made it impossible to mount an expedition to recover them, he refused to abandon his plan entirely. He turned instead to what remained. Before the scattering, the Emperor's gene scientists had harvested samples of genetic material from each of the developing Primarchs. These samples, stored separately from the gestation capsules themselves, had survived the catastrophe intact. They were not enough to recreate the Primarchs, not enough to replace what had been lost, but they were enough for something else, something that the Emperor had perhaps always intended, but had now become necessity rather than choice. They were enough to create gene seed. The process of transforming the Primarch genetic samples into usable gene seed was itself a triumph of bioscience. The Emperor took the DNA harvested from each of his 20 sons and began the painstaking work of breaking it down into components that could be used to enhance ordinary humans. The Primarchs were too powerful, too fundamentally altered from baseline humanity, for their genetics to be simply transplanted into a normal person. The transformation would kill the recipient, their body unable to handle the massive changes being forced upon it. Instead, the Emperor and his team of gene wrights isolated specific traits from each Primarch's genome, identifying the sequences that granted enhanced strength, accelerated healing, improved reflexes, and dozens of other beneficial modifications. These isolated genetic sequences were then used to create 19 specialized organs, each one designed to be implanted into a human host and to modify that host's biology in specific ways. This was the gene seed, the foundation upon which the Space Marines would be built. Each organ served a particular purpose, and together they would transform a normal human into something approaching the Primarchs themselves, though on a lesser scale. A Space Marine would never be as powerful as a Primarch, would never possess the same combination of physical might, psychic potential, and spiritual charisma. But he would be far superior to any normal human, and most importantly, the process could be replicated. The 19 organs that the Emperor created represented perhaps the greatest achievement in the history of genetic engineering. Each one was a marvel of biotechnology, a living machine that would integrate with the human body and reshape it from within. Some of these organs would enhance existing systems, making the heart stronger, the lungs more efficient, the muscles more powerful. Others would create entirely new capabilities, allowing a Space Marine to survive in environments that would kill unaugmented humans, to process poisons and toxins, to heal from wounds with supernatural speed. And still others would alter the Space Marine's very relationship with his equipment, allowing him to interface directly with his power armor and wield it as if it were an extension of his own body. The first of these organs was the secondary heart, sometimes called the maintainer. This additional heart was implanted into the chest cavity of the aspirant and connected to the existing circulatory system. Once functional, it served as a backup to the primary heart, capable of maintaining full life functions even if the original heart was damaged or destroyed. More than that, It could boost blood flow during combat, flooding the body with oxygen and nutrients when maximum performance was required. A space marine with both hearts functioning could survive in low oxygen environments that would leave normal humans gasping for breath. He could endure exertion that would cause a normal heart to fail, and most crucially, he gained a redundancy that made him extraordinarily difficult to kill by conventional means. The second organ, the os modula, was a small tubular structure that monitored and controlled bone growth. Once implanted, it secreted hormones that encouraged the skeleton to absorb ceramic-based chemicals administered in the Space Marine's diet. Over a period of years, this process would transform the bones themselves, making them harder, denser, and far more resistant to fracture. The rib cage would undergo extreme ossification, creating a natural armor that protected the vital organs beneath. The long bones of the arms and legs would become cables of reinforced material, capable of withstanding impacts that would shatter normal human bones like glass. By the time the process was complete, a Space Marine skeleton would be more akin to the support structure of a building than the fragile framework of flesh that normal humans possessed. The third organ worked in tandem with the os modula. The biscopea was implanted in the chest cavity and served to dramatically enhance muscle growth. It worked by stimulating the existing muscle tissue, causing it to grow larger and denser, while also improving the efficiency with which those muscles could convert nutrients into energy. A Space Marine's muscles, under the influence of the biscopea, would become capable of exerting force far beyond what their size would suggest. A Marine who was 8 feet tall might possess strength equivalent to a normal human twice that size. The muscle fibers themselves would be reorganized, becoming more responsive to neural commands, allowing for faster reaction times and more precise control. These first 3 organs formed the foundation of the Space Marine's physical transformation, reshaping the basic structures of bone and muscle that would support all the other enhancements. But they were only the beginning. The fourth organ, the hemastamen, was implanted in the blood vessels of the neck and served to modify the blood itself. It increased the production of red blood cells, allowing the blood to carry more oxygen to the muscles and organs. It also modified the white blood cells, making them more aggressive in attacking infections and foreign organisms. A Space Marine's blood, enhanced by the hemastamen, would be thicker than normal human blood, clotting more quickly when wounds were sustained, and better able to deliver the oxygen and nutrients that the enhanced body demanded. The fifth organ was perhaps one of the most remarkable. Larraman's organ was a liver-sized implant connected to the circulatory system. It generated specialized cells called Larraman cells, which were released into the bloodstream whenever the Space Marine was wounded. These cells would attach to white blood cells and be carried to the site of injury. Upon contact with air, they would form into a tough, fibrous material, a kind of instant scar tissue that would seal even grievous wounds in a matter of moments. A Space Marine who lost an arm could survive the trauma that would send a normal human into fatal shock, his body automatically sealing the massive wound before he could bleed out. Lesser injuries, things that would incapacitate a normal soldier for weeks, would be patched over in hours or even minutes. The sixth organ addressed one of the greatest limitations of the human body. The catalepsian node was implanted into the brain, specifically into the occipital lobe, though its effects were felt throughout the neural structure. This pea-sized organ modified the Space Marine's sleep patterns, allowing him to rest while remaining partially conscious. By shutting down different areas of the brain in sequence, a Space Marine could achieve restorative sleep while still maintaining awareness of his surroundings. He could stand watch while sleeping, could march for days without true rest, could fight, and then recover without ever fully lowering his guard. This made Space Marines capable of sustained operations that would break normal human soldiers, their ability to function without proper sleep, giving them an enormous tactical advantage. The seventh organ, the preomno, was a large implant that fit into the chest cavity and served as a pre-digestive stomach. Food would pass through the preomno before reaching the normal stomach. where it would be analyzed and broken down by powerful acids and enzymes. This allowed a space marine to eat almost anything organic, from rotting meat to mildly poisonous plants, and extract nutrition from it. More importantly, it allowed the space marine to neutralize many poisons and toxins before they could enter the bloodstream, making him highly resistant to attempts to poison him through food or drink. A space marine could subsist on rations that would kill a normal human, could eat the local flora and fauna of alien worlds without fear, and could survive on minimal supplies in hostile environments. The eighth organ worked in conjunction with the preomno, the wall. Omophagia was implanted at the base of the brain and connected to the stomach and nervous system. This organ allowed a space marine to gain information by eating the flesh of an organism. Chemical markers in the consumed tissue would be analyzed by the omophagia, which would then transmit that information directly to the space marine's brain. By eating a portion of an enemy, a space marine could potentially gain access to some of that enemy's memories, learning the location of hidden bases, the passwords to secure facilities, or other tactical information. This disturbing ability had profound implications for space marine operations, though it was one that many chapters rarely employed, viewing it as too savage or unreliable. The ninth organ represented a significant enhancement to the space marine's sensory capabilities. The multi-lung was a third lung, larger than the primary two, that was implanted in the chest cavity. This organ allowed the space marine to breathe in environments that would be lethal to normal humans. In low oxygen atmospheres, the multi-lung could extract every possible molecule of oxygen, keeping the body supplied even when normal lungs would fail. In toxic atmospheres, the multi-lung could filter out many harmful substances, allowing the space marine to survive brief exposures to chemical weapons or industrial pollutants. And in the vacuum of space, the multi-lung could shut down entirely while the other organs maintained life functions, allowing a space marine to survive for up to an hour in hard vacuum. The 10th organ enhanced the space marine's vision in ways that seemed almost supernatural. The oculobe was implanted into the eye sockets, where it modified the eyes themselves at a genetic level. Over time, as the oculobe matured, it would grant the space marine enhanced visual acuity, allowing him to see details at distances that would be a blur to normal human eyes. It would also improve his low-light vision, letting him see clearly in conditions that would leave normal humans effectively blind. And it would allow him to track fast-moving objects with ease, following the flight of a bullet or the movement of an enemy combatant with perfect clarity. A space marine's eyes, under the influence of the oculobe, would become weapons of war in their own right, gathering information that could mean the difference between victory and defeat.
You know, every time I dive into this lore, I'm struck by how dark the Emperor's choices really were. We celebrate space marines as heroes, and they absolutely are. Think about what they gave up. These were children, 10 to 14 years old, who had their entire humanity systematically stripped away and rebuilt. They can never have families, never truly retire, never just be human again. The Emperor created the perfect weapon, but the cost was turning boys into living weapons who could never go back. It's brilliant and horrifying in equal measure, which is exactly what makes 40K so compelling. Anyways, back to the story.
The 11th organ addressed the space marine's ability to survive in extreme environments. The lineman's ear was implanted in the inner ear and modified both hearing and balance. It enhanced the space marine's auditory capabilities, allowing him to hear sounds across a wider frequency range than normal humans. More importantly, it regulated the space marine's sense of balance, making him immune to vertigo and able to maintain his orientation even in zero gravity or when subjected to rapid changes in motion. A space marine could fight effectively while tumbling through space, could navigate in complete darkness using sound alone, and could withstand the disorienting effects of rapid acceleration that would incapacitate normal humans. The 12th organ was relatively simple, but no less vital. The Susan membrane was implanted in the brain and allowed the space marine to enter a state of suspended animation when critically injured. If a space marine sustained wounds that would otherwise prove fatal, the Susan membrane could activate automatically, putting him into a death-like trance that would preserve his life functions at the absolute minimum level. In this state, a space marine could survive for years or even decades, waiting to be discovered and revived by his battle brothers. This organ ensured that even catastrophic injury did not necessarily mean death, that a space marine who fell in battle might yet live to fight again if his body could be recovered in time. The 13th organ represented another layer of protection against the harsh realities of war. The melanchrome, implanted beneath the skin, modified the body's response to radiation. When exposed to dangerous levels of radiation, the melanchrome would secrete chemicals that darkened the skin, providing protection against further exposure. This allowed space marines to fight in radioactive environments, to survive nuclear strikes that would kill unprotected humans, and to operate in the void of space, where cosmic radiation posed a constant threat. The darkening effect was temporary, fading once the radiation exposure ceased. But it could mean the difference between life and death in the most extreme combat situations. The 14th organ addressed one of the most fundamental challenges of the Space Marine's enhanced physiology. The oolitic kidney was implanted alongside the normal kidneys and served to filter the blood more efficiently than any natural organ could. It could remove toxins, neutralize poisons, and even process some radioactive elements, rendering them harmless before they could damage the body. This made Space Marines highly resistant to chemical and biological weapons, able to fight in environments contaminated with nerve gas or biological agents that would kill normal humans in moments. The oolitic kidney worked in concert with the preomnor and other organs to create a layered defense against poisoning, ensuring that a Space Marine could survive on hostile worlds or in the aftermath of chemical warfare. The 15th organ was one of the most unusual. The neuroglottis was implanted in the mouth and connected to the nervous system. It allowed a Space Marine to taste and analyze substances with extraordinary precision, identifying chemical compositions and detecting even minute traces of toxins or poisons. A Space Marine could taste the air and determine what kind of atmosphere he was breathing, could sample water and know if it was safe to drink, could even detect the presence of enemies by tasting their scent on the wind. This gave Space Marines an additional sensory capability that complemented their enhanced vision and hearing, making them extraordinarily difficult to ambush or poison. The 16th organ provided protection against environmental extremes. The mucranoid was implanted in the lower intestine, where its hormonal secretions modified the sweat glands throughout the body. When activated through chemical therapy, these modified glands would secrete an oily substance that coated the skin. This substance provided protection against extremes of temperature, insulating the Space Marine against both bitter cold and searing heat. More remarkably, it offered some protection even in vacuum, allowing a Space Marine to survive brief exposure to hard vacuum without a sealed suit. Combined with the multi-lung and other organs, this made Space Marines capable of operating in environments that would be instantly lethal to normal humans. The 17th organ was as dangerous as it was useful. The Betcher's gland was actually two identical glands, implanted either in the lower lip or in the hard palate of the mouth. These glands worked like the poison glands of venomous reptiles, synthesizing and storing deadly toxins. A Space Marine could spit these toxins at enemies, the corrosive substances capable of burning through flesh or even eating through metal given enough time. The acid produced by the Betcher's gland was remarkably versatile, its composition adjustable through conscious control to create different effects. A Space Marine could produce a highly corrosive acid capable of eating through plasteel, or a contact poison that would cause paralysis and death in unaugmented humans. The glands could store enough venom for multiple uses before needing time to replenish their reserves, and experienced Space Marines learned to regulate the strength and composition of their spit with precision. The Betcher's gland could also serve as a last resort weapon, allowing a captured Space Marine to destroy his own equipment or create an opening in a wall or door. During the Great Crusade, There were documented instances of space marines using their acidic saliva to escape from enemy prisons, slowly dissolving the bars or locks that held them over the course of hours or days. Others used it to sabotage enemy equipment, spitting acid into the mechanisms of weapons or vehicles to render them inoperable. The versatility of this implant made it one of the more feared aspects of space marine physiology among their enemies. It was a reminder that space marines were weapons from their bones to their saliva, every part of their body modified to make them more effective killers. There was no aspect of their physiology that had not been considered for its potential military application. Even their blood, their sweat, their very breath had been engineered to serve the Emperor's purposes. This total transformation, this complete weaponization of the human form, was both the space marine's greatest strength and a source of unease among those who understood the full extent of the changes wrought upon them. The 18th organ was perhaps the most important of all. The progenoid glands were implanted in 2 locations, one in the neck and one in the chest. These organs served a single critical purpose. They harvested genetic material from all the other implanted organs and stored it as germ cells. Over time, these germ cells would mature into complete gene seed, genetic material that could be extracted from a space marine and used to create the next generation of warriors. The progenoid gland in the neck would mature in about 5 years, while the one in the chest required 10 years to fully develop. Upon a space marine's death, apothecaries would use a specialized tool called a reductor to extract both progenoid glands, recovering the gene seed within and ensuring that their fallen brother's genetic legacy would continue in new warriors. This was the only form of reproduction space marines knew, their progenoid glands creating new life from their own modified biology, ensuring that the chapter would never die as long as gene seed could be recovered. The 19th and final organ was the most distinctive. The black carapace was not implanted as a single organ, but rather as sheets of specially engineered tissue that were placed directly beneath the skin of the torso. Once in place, this tissue would expand and harden, forming a black, plastic-like layer that sent neural bundles deep into the space marine's body. After several months of growth, the black carapace would be cut and fitted with neural sensors and connection points. These artificial ports meshed perfectly with the systems built into space marine power armor, allowing direct neural connection between the warrior and his equipment. Without the black carapace, power armor was just an advanced suit of protection. With it, the armor became an extension of the space marine's own body, responding to his thoughts as quickly as his own limbs would, making him faster and more agile than any amount of servo motors alone could achieve. These 19 organs, working in concert, would transform a human being into a space marine. But the Emperor had not created them in isolation. Each organ had been derived from a specific Primarch's genetic code, and each legion created from a Primarch's gene seed would carry subtle variations that reflected their genetic father. Marines created from Sanguinius's gene seed, who would form the Blood Angels Legion, would be faster and more agile than others, with enhanced reflexes that made them devastating in close combat. Marines from Ferrus Manus's gene seed, the Iron Hands, would have an unusual affinity for cybernetic augmentation. Marines from Vulcan's gene seed, the Salamanders, would have tougher skin and greater resistance to fire and radiation. Each legion would be unique, bearing the genetic legacy of their Primarch, even if they had never met the being who had sired their gene seed. But having the gene seed was only the first step. The Emperor still needed to determine how to implant these organs into human subjects, how to transform normal men into transhuman warriors without killing them in the process. The implantation procedure that would eventually be developed was the result of years of experimentation, trial and error, and careful refinement. And it began during the final years of the Unification Wars, as the first Space Marines were created to fight alongside the Thunder Warriors in the conquest of Terra. The process of creating a Space Marine began with selection. Not every human was compatible with the gene seed. The implants required recipients who were young, typically between 10 and 14 years old, before they had completed physical maturity. The human body at that age was still growing, still plastic enough to accept the massive changes that the gene seed would bring. Attempting to implant gene seed into an adult would almost certainly result in death, the body's systems unable to adapt to the rapid transformation. This was one of the key differences between Thunder Warriors and Space Marines. While Thunder Warriors had been created from adult volunteers through rapid and brutal augmentation, Space Marines would be built from children, their bodies reshaped over years of careful enhancement. The candidates also had to be male. The gene seed organs were keyed to male hormones and genetic structures, and attempts to implant them into female subjects resulted in catastrophic rejection. This was not a limitation the Emperor could easily overcome without fundamentally redesigning the entire gene seed template. And given the urgency of his situation after the loss of the Primarchs, he chose to work with what he had rather than delay further while attempting to solve this particular problem. Thus, from the very beginning, only young males could become Space Marines. Even among young males, compatibility was rare. The gene seed required very specific tissue types and genetic markers to function properly. A candidate had to possess the right combination of genetic traits that existed in only a small percentage of the population. For this reason, every potential recruit underwent extensive tissue compatibility testing before being accepted as an aspirant. These tests would analyze the candidate's DNA, looking for the markers that indicated they could survive the implantation process. Even with positive results, there were no guarantees. Many aspirants would die during the transformation, their bodies rejecting one or more of the implants, despite showing initial compatibility. Those who passed the tissue tests then underwent psychological screening. The Emperor needed warriors who possessed not just physical potential, but also mental fortitude. Candidates were evaluated for their courage, their determination, their ability to endure pain and hardship without breaking. They were tested in ways that would reveal their true character, subjected to trials that would break weaker spirits. Only those who showed the right combination of strength, loyalty, and mental resilience would be accepted into the ranks of aspirants and allowed to begin the transformation. The implantation process itself took years and followed a carefully structured timeline. The organs could not all be implanted at once. Some had to be in place and functioning before others could be added. The body needed time to adapt to each new modification before the next one could be introduced. Rushing the process would result in rejection, organ failure, and death. The Emperor and his gene scientists developed a specific sequence, a progression of phases that would maximize the chances of survival and ensure that each organ had time to integrate properly with the aspirant's physiology. The first three organs, the secondary heart, osmodula, and biscopea, were typically implanted together between the ages of 10 and 14. These foundational implants would begin the process of reshaping the skeleton and muscular system, changes that would take years to fully manifest. The aspirant would be placed under anesthesia for the surgery, the organs carefully positioned within the body and connected to the appropriate biological systems. Recovery from this initial surgery could take months, during which time the aspirant would experience significant pain as his bones began to absorb ceramics and his muscles started to grow beyond their natural limits. The fourth and fifth organs, the hemastamen and Laramann's organ, could be implanted together between ages 12 and 14. These would modify the blood and introduce the rapid healing capabilities that would make Space Marines so difficult to kill. Again, the surgery would require months of recovery, and the aspirant would need to be carefully monitored to ensure the new organs were functioning correctly and not being rejected by the immune system. The sixth organ, the catalepsian node, was implanted between ages 14 and 17, often coinciding with the beginning of hypnotherapy. This was when the aspirant would begin learning to consciously control some of the changes happening to his body. when he would be taught how to manage his enhanced metabolism and how to make use of abilities that normal humans did not possess. The implantation of the catalepsian node marked a turning point, as the aspirant began to actively participate in his own transformation rather than simply enduring it. The following series of organs, from the 7th through the 13th, would be implanted in clusters between ages 14 and 16. Each cluster required its own surgery, its own recovery period, its own time for integration. The preomnor and ommophagia would reshape the digestive system. The multi-lung and oculobe would enhance respiration and vision. The limens, ear and succinate membrane would modify hearing and introduce suspended animation capabilities. The melanchrome and oolitic kidney would provide protection against radiation and poisons. By this point, the aspirant would no longer look fully human. He would be larger, his proportions subtly wrong, his features beginning to take on the harsh cast that marked all space marines. The 14th and 15th organs, the neuroglottis and mucranoid, would typically be implanted together between ages 15 and 16. These final sensory and protective enhancements would give the aspirant capabilities that seemed almost superhuman to outside observers. The ability to taste chemicals in the air and survive in hard vacuum. But there were still 3 organs left, 3 final modifications that would complete the transformation. The Becher's gland would be implanted next, giving the aspirant a weapon that was as much a part of him as his own teeth. This was often one of the more difficult implants to adjust to, as aspirants had to learn to control the secretion of the toxic saliva, to use it when needed without accidentally poisoning themselves. The progenoid glands, the 18th implant, would be added between ages 16 and 18. These organs were treated with particular reverence, as they represented the aspirant's ability to contribute to the future of his chapter. Once the progenoids were in place and functioning, the aspirant was no longer just a recipient of gene seed, but a potential source of it, a link in the chain that connected past and future generations of space marines. The final implant, the black carapace, was reserved for the very last stage of transformation. By this point, the aspirant had endured years of surgery, pain, and adaptation. He had grown to his full height, often well over 7 feet tall. His body had been reshaped from the inside out, every system modified or enhanced. The black carapace would be the finishing touch, the implant that would allow him to don power armor and truly become what he was meant to be. The surgery to implant the black carapace was extensive, requiring large sheets of the engineered tissue to be placed beneath the skin of the torso. The aspirant would then wait months for the tissue to fully integrate, to send its neural connections throughout his body. Only when the black carapace was fully mature, when the interface ports had been cut and fitted, would the aspirant be considered ready to become a full space marine. But the physical implantation was only part of the transformation. Throughout this entire process, which could take 6 years or more, the aspirant would also undergo intensive psychological conditioning. This was necessary because the physical changes were so extreme that the mind had to be prepared to accept them. An unprepared psyche might reject what was happening to the body, might fracture under the strain of transformation. The Emperor's gene scientists had developed specific techniques to prevent this, methods that combined hypnotherapy, chemical treatment, and indoctrination to reshape the aspirant's mind, even as his body was reshaped. The hypnotherapy began around the time the catalepsian node was implanted. Aspirants would be placed in machines called hypnomats, devices that would put them into deep hypnotic trances while subjecting them to visual and auditory stimuli. In this state, they would learn to consciously control their own metabolisms, to regulate their new organs, to use abilities that no normal human possessed. They would be taught to slow their heartbeats when wounded, to activate their mucranoid when entering hostile environments, to shut down pain receptors when necessary to continue fighting. This conscious control of normally unconscious processes was what separated space marines from mere enhanced humans. A space marine didn't just have superior organs, He could actively control those organs, directing their functions with precision that bordered on the supernatural. The chemical treatment was equally important. Throughout the implantation process, aspirants would be given carefully formulated drugs and hormones to help their bodies accept the changes. Some of these chemicals would suppress the immune system temporarily, preventing rejection of the new organs. Others would stimulate growth, encouraging bones to absorb ceramics or muscles to bulk up beyond normal limits. Still others would alter brain chemistry, preparing the mind for the psychological stresses of transformation. The exact formulas varied between chapters and even between individual aspirants, as the apothecaries responsible for the transformation would adjust their approach based on how each aspirant responded to the process. The indoctrination was perhaps the most profound change of all. The Emperor understood that warriors as powerful as space marines could not simply be set loose upon the galaxy with their own agendas and ambitions. They needed to be bound to the Imperium with chains stronger than mere loyalty, with convictions that went beyond simple obedience. They needed to believe, with every fiber of their being, in the righteousness of their cause and the necessity of their sacrifice. And so, alongside the physical transformation and the hypnotherapy, aspirants would be subjected to intense ideological conditioning. This conditioning began from the moment an aspirant was accepted into the chapter. Before even the first organ was implanted, the young candidate would be immersed in the culture and history of his future brotherhood. He would learn the deeds of great heroes from his chapter's past, studying their tactics and absorbing the lessons of their victories and defeats. He would memorize the names of fallen battle brothers, carrying forward the memory of those who had given their lives in service to the Emperor. He would participate in rituals that dated back to the chapter's founding, ceremonies that connected him to an unbroken chain of warriors stretching back through the centuries to the very first founding. They would learn the history of the Emperor's rise, told in terms that emphasized his wisdom and benevolence. They would study the Great Crusade's purpose, understanding their role as liberators of lost human worlds rather than conquerors. The narrative presented to aspirants was carefully crafted to instill specific values and beliefs. They would learn that the Emperor had sacrificed everything to save humanity, that he had condemned himself to 10,000 years of agony upon the Golden Throne rather than abandon his people. They would learn that the Imperium, for all its flaws, represented humanity's only hope for survival in a hostile galaxy. They would learn that aliens could not be trusted, that they viewed humanity as prey or competition, that showing mercy to Xenos was a betrayal of the human race itself. They would memorize the doctrines of their legion, the traditions and values that defined what it meant to be a warrior of their particular brotherhood. Each chapter had its own interpretation of what it meant to serve the Emperor, its own emphasis on particular virtues. The Ultramarines stressed discipline, tactical flexibility, and adherence to the Codex Astartes. The Blood Angels emphasized nobility, artistry, and the constant struggle against the darker aspects of their nature. The Space Wolves valued individual prowess, pack loyalty, and the warrior's pride. The Dark Angels taught secrecy, the burden of knowledge, and the endless hunt for redemption. These differing philosophies shaped how aspirants understood their purpose and their place in the galaxy. They would undergo rituals of initiation, ceremonies that bound them to their chapter, with oaths that could never be broken. These rituals varied wildly between chapters, reflecting their different cultures and traditions. Some involved trials of pain, tests, designed to prove that the aspirant could endure suffering without breaking. Others required demonstrations of skill, proving the aspirant worthy through martial prowess or tactical acumen. Still others were more spiritual in nature, involving visions induced by drugs or psychic manipulation, experiences that would forge an indelible connection between the aspirant and his chapter's identity. By the time an aspirant completed his transformation, he would be as much a product of psychological conditioning as of genetic engineering. His loyalty to the Emperor and the Imperium would be absolute, hardwired into his very identity in ways that made betrayal almost inconceivable. He would think of himself not primarily as an individual, but as a member of his chapter, a link in a chain that extended from the past into the future. His own desires and ambitions would be subsumed beneath his duty. His personal identity merged with the collective identity of his brotherhood. This was intentional, a deliberate reshaping of the psyche to match the reshaping of the body, creating warriors who were fundamentally different from the humans they had once been in mind as well as flesh. Almost, but not entirely. The Horus heresy would later prove that even space marines could be turned from their purpose, that even the most powerful conditioning could be overcome by certain influences. But in the early days of the first founding, as the Emperor's gene scientists perfected their techniques for creating space marines, such concerns seemed distant and unlikely. The focus was on refinement, on perfecting the process, on creating warriors who could survive the transformation and emerge ready to fight for humanity's future. And they succeeded beyond even the Emperor's most optimistic projections. The space marines who emerged from the gene laboratories were everything he had hoped for and more. They were faster, stronger, and more resilient than the Thunder Warriors had been, while also being mentally stable and capable of lifespans measured in centuries rather than decades. They could learn tactics and strategy, could adapt to changing battlefield conditions, could function as both frontline warriors and garrison troops. They could build as well as destroy, govern as well as conquer. They were, in every way that mattered, superior to the prototype warriors who had preceded them. The first Space Marines were created in the final years of the Unification Wars, when Terra's conquest was nearly complete, but a few stubborn pockets of resistance remained. These proto-Astartes fought alongside the Thunder Warriors in the last great battles, proving their worth in combat against foes that had managed to stand against the Emperor's forces for years. At Auriok, deep in the southern ice mountains, it was the 17th Legion, later to be known as the Word-Bearers, who finally broke the city-state's resistance. At Venori, it was Space Marines who led the assault, that brought yet another stronghold under Imperial control. And in dozens of other engagements, these new warriors demonstrated that they could match the Thunder Warriors in combat effectiveness, while possessing the stability and longevity that made them suitable for the greater war to come. It was after the Battle of Mount Ararat, the engagement that the Imperial Chronicles would record as the final battle of the Unification Wars, that the full transition from Thunder Warriors to Space Marines occurred. The official histories claimed that the Thunder Warriors had died to a man in that glorious last stand, sacrificing themselves to raise the banner of unity over a conquered terror. The truth was darker and would remain hidden for millennia. The Thunder Warriors had not died in battle against the Emperor's enemies. They had been culled by the Emperor's servants, purged to make way for the Space Marines who would replace them. The reasoning was pragmatic, if brutal. The Thunder Warriors, for all their service, were fundamentally unsuitable for the galactic crusade the Emperor envisioned. Their short lifespans meant they would die off within a few decades at most. Many were already showing signs of cellular degeneration, their enhanced bodies breaking down under the strain of modifications that had never been designed for long-term stability. Some had become mentally unstable, their aggression growing beyond the ability of their commanders to control. Others suffered from catastrophic organ failures, their enhanced physiology collapsing in ways that were painful to witness and impossible to prevent. Their mental instability made them unreliable for long-term operations or governance roles. A Thunder Warrior might fight with unmatched fury one day and descend into psychotic rage the next, turning on allies or civilians without warning. The Emperor could not risk deploying such warriors to newly conquered worlds where they might terrorize the very populations they were meant to protect. Their savage nature, which had served well in the brutal combat of the Unification Wars, where mercy was a luxury terror could not afford, was ill-suited to the more nuanced work of rebuilding civilization on conquered worlds. The Emperor needed warriors who could fight a war that might last centuries, who could be trusted with positions of authority, who could represent the Imperium to newly discovered human populations without terrifying them into resistance. The Space Marines could be those warriors. The Thunder Warriors could not. And so, in an act that would cast a long shadow over the future of the Imperium, the Emperor ordered the extermination of the warriors who had won him the throne of terror. The Custodian Guard and the newly formed Space Marine legions carried out the purge with ruthless efficiency, killing Thunder Warriors who had no reason to suspect their creator would turn on them. The betrayal was methodical and thorough. Thunder Warriors were isolated from their comrades, divided into small groups that could be overwhelmed by the combined forces of Custodians and Astartes. Some were told they were being honored with new assignments, only to be led into ambushes. Others were simply attacked without warning, cut down by warriors they had fought beside during the Unification Wars. Some fought back, making the culling more difficult than anticipated. Even dying, even suffering from the degradation that plagued their gene enhancements, the Thunder Warriors were formidable opponents. Individual Thunder Warriors managed to kill multiple Custodians or Space Marines before being overwhelmed. Small groups of Thunder Warriors, realizing what was happening, fortified positions and fought desperate last stands that cost their attackers dearly. The gene-bulked warriors of the Legiones Cartagus died as they had lived, selling their lives at the highest price they could extract. But in the end, they were overwhelmed, and the Thunder Warriors passed into history as legends rather than living complications. A few survived, individuals who escaped the initial purge or who were away from the main concentrations when the killing began. These survivors would haunt the shadows of terror and beyond, some seeking revenge, others simply trying to survive with their failing bodies, all of them bearing witness to the Emperor's willingness to sacrifice even his most loyal servants when they ceased to serve his purposes. Their existence would remain a dark secret, but their fate would not be forgotten by those who learned of it. When the Space Marine legions later heard rumors of what had truly happened to their predecessors, it planted seeds of doubt that would eventually contribute to the greatest betrayal the Imperium would ever face. But in the immediate aftermath of unification, such concerns were distant. The Emperor had conquered terror. He had forged an alliance with the Mechanicum of Mars, gaining access to their vast industrial capacity and their knowledge of lost technologies. And he had created the tool he needed to reconquer the galaxy. 20 Space Marine legions, numbering in the tens of thousands, each one bearing the gene seed of one of his lost sons. It was time for the Great Crusade to begin. The organization of the first founding legions followed patterns that the Emperor had developed through long study of military history and his own extensive experience in warfare. Each legion was built around the same basic structure, a hierarchy of command that allowed for flexibility in deployment while maintaining clear chains of authority. At the head of each legion was a Primarch position, though these posts remained unfilled until the lost sons could be found. In the meantime, senior officers drawn from the ranks of Terran-born Space Marines, warriors who had proven themselves in the final battles of the Unification Wars, commanded the legions. Below the Primarch level, each legion was divided into companies, battalions, and chapters, terms that would later take on different meanings after the Codex Astartes reorganization, but that served well enough for the massive forces the Emperor was assembling. A legion might number anywhere from 10,000 to more than 100,000 Space Marines, depending on recruitment rates, battlefield casualties, and the availability of gene seed for creating new warriors. Some legions grew more quickly than others, their gene seed proving more stable or their recruiting methods more efficient. The structure varied somewhat between legions, with each developing its own organizational quirks based on the campaigns they fought and the preferences of their commanders. The First Legion, which would become the Dark Angels, maintained a highly regimented structure with clearly defined roles and hierarchies. They organized their forces into specialized wings, each focused on a particular aspect of warfare. The Death Wing, composed of elite Terminators, handled the most dangerous close-quarters combat. The Raven Wing, mounted on bikes and speeder vehicles, served as rapid response and reconnaissance forces. The Dreadwing carried the most terrible weapons in the Legion's arsenal, instruments of mass destruction that were deployed only when total annihilation was required. This specialization allowed the First Legion to respond to any tactical situation with precision and overwhelming force. The Third Legion, the Emperor's children, organized themselves according to principles of perfection and excellence. They maintained rigorous standards for acceptance into their ranks, culling any aspirant who showed even minor flaws or weaknesses. Their companies were led by officers chosen not just for tactical ability, but for their embodiment of the Legion's ideals of martial perfection. They practiced their tactics endlessly, seeking to eliminate all possibility of error or failure. This obsessive pursuit of flawlessness made them extraordinarily effective in combat, but it also bred a dangerous pride that would later be exploited by the forces of chaos. The Ultramarines, created from the gene seed of Roboute Guilliman, would become the largest of all the legions, their numbers eventually swelling to over 250,000 warriors. Their gene seed was remarkably stable, with very low rejection rates and few mutations, allowing for rapid recruitment and expansion. The Ultramarines developed a reputation for tactical flexibility and adherence to military doctrine that would later be codified in Guilliman's Codex Astartes. They could adapt to any combat situation, their commanders trained in a wide range of tactical approaches and able to shift strategies mid-battle as circumstances required. This adaptability, combined with their vast numbers, made them one of the most formidable forces in the Emperor's arsenal. In contrast, the Thousand Sons, whose gene seed came from Magnus the Red, remained relatively small because many of their aspirants developed mutations or uncontrollable psychic powers that made them unsuitable for service. The Legion suffered from a genetic defect that caused random mutations to manifest in many of its warriors, transformations that could be anything from minor cosmetic changes to catastrophic physical alterations that required the affected Marine to be euthanized. This flaw, known as the flesh change, plagued the Thousand Sons throughout the Great Crusade and would ultimately play a role in their fall to chaos. Despite their small numbers, the Thousand Sons were exceptionally powerful, as many of their warriors possessed psychic abilities that made them devastating on the battlefield. Similarly, the Emperor's children started with very small numbers because much of Fulgrim's gene seed had been lost in the accident that scattered the Primarchs, leaving only a tiny sample from which to work. This scarcity made each warrior of the Third Legion extraordinarily precious to the Emperor, and they were used sparingly until Fulgrim could be found and his gene seed harvested to replenish their stocks. The Legion's small size and the Emperor's clear favor toward their Primarch created an intense pressure to excel, to prove themselves worthy of the trust placed in them. This pressure drove the Emperor's children to achieve remarkable feats of arms, but it also fostered the perfectionism that would eventually corrupt them. Each legion was equipped with the finest weapons and armor that the Imperium could produce. The Mechanicum of Mars, true to their treaty with the Emperor, provided the legions with power armor of increasingly sophisticated design. Early patterns like the Mark II Crusade armor gave way to more advanced versions as the Great Crusade progressed, and the tech priests refined their craft. Bolt guns, those iconic weapons that fired mass reactive explosive rounds, were manufactured by the millions and distributed to the legions. Tanks, aircraft, and orbital assault craft were constructed in numbers that staggered the imagination. Entire fleets assembled to carry the Emperor's armies to the stars. But more than equipment, each legion developed its own character, its own traditions and methods of warfare. Even before they were reunited with their Primarchs, the legions began to diverge from one another in subtle ways. The First Legion, later to be known as the Dark Angels, was the Emperor's prototype, the first to be fully formed and the one he kept closest to his side during the early Crusade. They received the most advanced equipment, the best training, and the Emperor's direct attention in a way that the other legions did not. This created a sense of pride and exceptionalism among the First Legion's warriors, a belief that they were the Emperor's chosen that would define them throughout their existence. The Third Legion, the Emperor's children, developed an obsession with perfection that stemmed from their small numbers and the knowledge that they bore the gene seed of a Primarch the Emperor seemed to hold in particularly high regard. They pushed themselves to excel in every aspect of warfare, to achieve flawless execution in tactics and strategy, to embody the ideal of what a Space Marine should be. This drive for perfection would later become a fatal flaw when it transformed into pride and arrogance. But in the early days of the Crusade, it made them some of the most effective warriors in the Imperium's arsenal. The 7th Legion, the Imperial Fists, became known for their skill in siege warfare and fortification. Even before they found their Primarch, Rogel Dawn, they gravitated toward these specialties, their gene seed perhaps carrying some echo of the Primarch's own proclivities. They became the Emperor's go-to force for breaking enemy strongholds or establishing Imperial bastions on newly conquered worlds. Each legion developed such tendencies, characteristics that seemed to emerge from the gene seed itself, hints of the Primarch's personalities expressing themselves through the warriors created from their genetic material. The 8th Legion was prone to terrifying their enemies through psychological warfare, tactics that would later be formalized when they were reunited with their Primarch, Conrad Kurz, and became the Night Lords. The 12th Legion showed disturbing levels of aggression and bloodthirstiness, traits that would be magnified when they found Angron and became the World Eaters. The 15th Legion produced an unusually high proportion of Psykers, a reflection of Magnus the Red's own powerful psychic abilities. The Emperor and his scientists observed these emergent patterns with great interest. It suggested that the gene seed carried more than just physical traits, that something of each Primarch's essence had been encoded in the genetic material harvested before the scattering. This was both encouraging and concerning. It meant that when the legions were finally reunited with their Primarchs, there would be an instant connection, a recognition at the genetic level that would help bind the warriors to their father. But it also meant that any flaws in a Primarch's character might be reflected in his legion, amplified across tens of thousands of warriors who shared his gene seed. For now, though, such concerns were secondary to the great work at hand. The Emperor launched the Great Crusade with the full might of his Space Marine legions, sending them out into the galaxy to reclaim the lost worlds of humanity. And as the crusade progressed, as the legions conquered world after world and brought them into the Imperium's fold, the Emperor began the search for his missing sons. Finding the Primarchs was not a simple matter. They had been scattered across the galaxy, cast to worlds that could be anywhere among billions of star systems. The warp storms that had enabled their scattering had also made it impossible to simply scan the galaxy and locate them. The Emperor had to rely on more subtle methods, using his psychic abilities to sense the unique signatures of his sons' souls. When he detected one of those bright flames in the warp, he would direct the nearest legion to investigate, to make contact, to bring his son home. The first Primarch to be found, according to most accounts, was Horus. Discovered on the world of Chthoniya, he was already a war leader there, having grown up in the gang wars of that harsh world and risen to command through strength and cunning. When the Emperor arrived, Horus recognized him immediately, kneeling before the father he had never known, but whose image was somehow familiar, encoded in his very genes. The Emperor took Horus back to Terra, showed him the Imperium that was being built, explained the purpose of the Great Crusade, and when Horus had been prepared, he gave him command of the 16th Legion, the Lunar Wolves, warriors who would be renamed the sons of Horus in honor of their Primarch. One by one, the other Primarchs were found. Leman Russ on Fenris, where he had been raised by wolves and become a king among the barbarian tribes. Lion L. Johnson on Caliban, where he had grown up in forests filled with monstrous beasts and emerged as a knight of unparalleled skill. Ferrus Manus on Medusa, where he had killed a creature of living metal and gained hands of silver necrodermis. Each Primarch had grown up in different circumstances, shaped by the worlds where they had landed, developing unique philosophies and methods of warfare. Some joined the Emperor eagerly, recognizing him as their creator and accepting their destiny without question. Sanguinius of Baal, the angelic Primarch with great wings growing from his back, pledged himself to his father immediately upon their meeting. Guilliman of Macragge, who had already built a thriving civilization on his adopted world, saw in the Emperor's vision something greater than his own achievements and willingly brought his world into the Imperium. Others had to be convinced or even defeated in single combat. Russ challenged the Emperor to a series of contests and yielded only after being bested in each one. Some, like Mortarion of Barbarus, harbored resentment at being forced to join the crusade, but ultimately accepted their role. And 2 Primarchs were lost entirely, their fates unknown even to the present day. The 2nd and 11th Legions were struck from Imperial records, their gene seed destroyed or locked away, their names forbidden to be spoken. What transgression they committed, what flaw in their gene seed or character led to their erasure, remains one of the greatest mysteries of the Imperium. Some whisper that the Emperor himself ordered their deletion, that whatever they had done or become was so terrible that even the memory of them had to be purged. Others suggest they were victims of some catastrophe, destroyed by forces beyond the Emperor's control. The truth died with those who witnessed it, and the silence that surrounds the lost legions is absolute. But 18 Primarchs were found and reunited with their legions, and when they were, the character of each legion crystallized. Horus shaped the Lunar Wolves into a force that excelled at rapid strikes and decapitation tactics. Guilliman transformed his Ultramarines into a model of tactical flexibility and adherence to military doctrine. Angron, despite being found too late to save from the cybernetic implants called the Butcher's Nails that had been forced into his brain, turned his World Eaters into berserkers who knew only fury. Magnus made his 1,000 sons a legion of scholar warriors who wielded psychic power alongside bolter and blade. The reunion of each Primarch with his legion marked a turning point, not just for that legion, but for the crusade as a whole. The Primarchs were everything the Emperor had hoped they would be: brilliant generals, charismatic, leaders, warriors, who could turn the tide of entire campaigns through their personal intervention. Under their leadership, the Space Marine legions achieved victories that would have been impossible before. Worlds that might have taken months to conquer fell in weeks. Alien empires that had seemed unconquerable were broken and scattered. The map of the Imperium expanded at a rate that exceeded even the Emperor's most optimistic projections. But the very qualities that made the Primarchs such effective commanders also contained the seeds of the Imperium's greatest catastrophe. They were not mere generals or administrators. They were beings of such power and presence that they inspired fanatical loyalty in their legions. The Space Marines did not just follow their Primarch's orders. They worshipped them as living gods, as figures who embodied everything they aspired to be. And when some of those Primarchs turned against the Emperor, when Horus and his brothers chose to serve the Chaos, gods, rather than their father, they took their legions with them. The Horus heresy would prove that the Emperor's vision of Space Marines, as loyal, stable warriors, was flawed in ways he had not anticipated. The same gene seed that granted them superhuman abilities also bound them to their Primarchs, with a connection that went beyond mere duty. The same psychological conditioning that made them fearless in battle also made them incapable of questioning their Primarch's commands, even when those commands meant betraying everything they had been taught to believe. The very perfection of the Space Marines, their absolute dedication to their Primarch's will, became a weakness when that will was turned against the Imperium. But that tragedy lay in the future. In the early days of the Great Crusade, when the Emperor walked among his sons and led them to victory after victory, it seemed that nothing could go wrong. The Space Marines were the perfect weapon. The Primarchs were the perfect generals, and the Imperium would unite the galaxy under the Emperor's benevolent rule. The vision that had led the Emperor to create the Thunder Warriors, to engineer the Primarchs, to develop the gene seed and perfect the process of creating Space Marines, seemed to be bearing fruit beyond all measure. The Emperor's design for Space Marines was based on principles that went beyond mere military effectiveness. He understood that creating warriors as powerful as Space Marines carried enormous risks. If they became too alien, too divorced from baseline humanity, they might cease to care about the people they were meant to protect. If they became too proud, too convinced of their own superiority, they might come to see themselves as the rightful rulers of humanity rather than its guardians. The Emperor needed to create beings who were more than human, but who remained fundamentally connected to humanity, who understood what they fought for and why it mattered. This is why the gene seed was derived from human DNA, why the Primarchs themselves had been crafted from the Emperor's own genetic code. Space Marines were not aliens wearing human form, they were humans elevated, humanity perfected, the next step in human evolution given physical form. A Space Marine could remember what it was like to be a normal human, could understand the fears and hopes and dreams of the people he protected, even if he could no longer fully share those experiences. This connection, this fundamental humanity that persisted despite all the enhancements, was what the Emperor believed would keep the Space Marines loyal to their purpose. He also understood that Space Marines needed to be warriors, not rulers. The Thunder Warriors had been too aggressive, too bloodthirsty, suitable only for war and nothing else. Space Marines would be different. They would be capable of great violence when necessary, but they would also possess the discipline and intelligence to know when violence was not the answer. They could negotiate, could administer, could build civilizations as well as destroy them. But ultimately, they were weapons, and weapons needed to be wielded by others rather than wielding power themselves. This philosophy informed every aspect of how Space Marines were created and trained. The psychological conditioning emphasized duty over ambition, service over rulership. Space Marines were taught that they existed to protect humanity, not to govern it. They were shown the Emperor's vision of a future where humans would rule themselves, guided by reason and enlightenment, rather than by transhuman warriors or superstition. The Space Marines were to be the sword that cleared the path for that future, but they were not to be the hand that ruled once the path was clear. Of course, this vision was complicated by the Primarchs. These beings were not mere warriors. They had been designed to be leaders, rulers, beings who could command not just armies, but entire sectors of space. Many of them had ruled their adopted worlds before the Emperor found them, had built civilizations and led nations. They were not content to simply be weapons, and the Emperor did not expect them to be. The Primarchs would be his proconsuls during the Crusade, granted authority over the territories they conquered, allowed to shape those worlds according to their own vision, as long as they remained loyal to the Imperium's overall purpose. But this created an inherent tension. The Primarchs were rulers, but the Space Marines they commanded were meant to be servants. The Primarchs had ambitions and desires, but the Space Marines were supposed to want only to fulfill their duty. This contradiction would become more apparent as the Crusade progressed, as some Primarchs began to chafe at the restrictions the Emperor placed upon them, as they wondered what their role would be once the Crusade was complete, and humanity no longer needed warriors of their caliber. The Emperor, for all his foresight and planning, did not anticipate how this tension would be exploited by the Chaos Gods. He did not foresee that beings as powerful as the Primarchs would be vulnerable to corruption, that their very strength and independence would become weaknesses when turned against them by entities that understood the nature of ambition and pride far better than he did. He believed that the genetic and psychic wards he had built into the Primarchs would protect them from the influence of chaos, that their loyalty to him and to humanity would be stronger than any temptation the dark gods could offer. He was wrong, and that mistake would cost the Imperium dearly. But even knowing what would come, even understanding the flaws in his design, it's difficult to see what else the Emperor could have done. He was working against impossible odds, trying to save a species on the brink of extinction, facing threats that spanned the physical and spiritual realms. He needed warriors powerful, enough to fight those threats, and power of the kind the Primarchs and Space Marines possessed always comes with risks. The question was never whether the creation of Space Marines was dangerous. The question was whether the danger they represented was less than the danger of trying to face the galaxy without them. And for 10,000 years, despite the heresy, despite the countless wars and schisms and betrayals, despite the degeneration of gene seed and the loss of knowledge and the slow decay of the Imperium itself, that answer has remained yes. The Space Marines are still humanity's greatest defenders, still the warriors who stand between the Imperium and oblivion. They are flawed, dangerous, often as much a threat to those they protect as to their enemies. But they are also necessary in a way that nothing else could be. The legacy of the Emperor's creation extends far beyond the original 18 loyalist legions. After the Horus heresy, when Roboute-Guilliman implemented the Codex Astartes and broke the legions into smaller chapters, the gene seed that had created those legions became the foundation for hundreds of new warrior brotherhoods. Each chapter traced its lineage back to one of the Primarchs, carrying that genetic legacy forward even as it developed its own identity and traditions. The Crimson Fists were sons of Rogel Dawn, the Blood Drinkers descended from Sanguinius, the Silver Skulls carried Guilliman's gene seed, and so on, a vast family tree of chapters, all stemming from the Emperor's work in those gene laboratories beneath the Himalaysian mountains so long ago. Over the millennia, the process of creating Space Marines has changed in some ways, while remaining fundamentally the same in others. The knowledge of how to create new gene seed from scratch was lost long ago, during the chaos of the Horus heresy and the age of apostasy that followed. Now, chapters depend entirely on the progenoid glands of their fallen brothers to create new gene seed, a limitation that makes each Space Marine's life even more precious. If a chapter suffers too many casualties without being able to recover the gene seed from the fallen, it can find itself unable to replace its losses, slowly dwindling toward extinction. The gene seed itself has degraded over time in some chapters. The Blood Angels and their successors suffer from genetic flaws that cause psychological instability, the red thirst that drives them to drink blood, and the black rage that makes them relive Sanguinius's final moments. The Space Wolves' gene seed has mutated to the point where they can only recruit from their homeworld of Fenris, as attempting to implant it into aspirants from other worlds results in catastrophic transformation into wolfen, half-human, half-wolf monsters. Other chapters have lost access to one or more of the 19 organs entirely, their gene seeds so degraded that certain implants can no longer be cultured. But despite these challenges, despite 10,000 years of war and loss and mutation, chapters still create new Space Marines using methods that would be recognizable to the Emperor himself. Young aspirants still undergo the trials that test their worthiness. Apothecaries still implant the 19 organs in the same sequence, at the same stages of development. Chaplains still oversee the psychological conditioning that turns boys into warriors. The process is slower now in many chapters, more ritualized, surrounded by ceremony and tradition that obscures some of the original scientific understanding. But at its core, it remains what the Emperor designed it to be, a transformation of human into transhuman, of mortal into near-immortal, of man into Astartes. The return of Roboute-Guilliman in the closing years of the 41st millennium brought new changes. The Primarch, awakened from 10,000 years of stasis and shocked by what the Imperium had become, authorized the creation of Primaris Space Marines. These new warriors were the work of Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Cawl, who had spent those same 10,000 years perfecting improvements to the original Space Marine template. Primaris Marines are larger than their firstborn brothers, enhanced by 3 additional organs beyond the original 19. They are more stable, their gene seed showing dramatically reduced mutation rates. And they are more powerful, capable of feats that even standard Space Marines struggle to match. The creation of Primaris Marines represents both a continuation and an evolution of the Emperor's work. Call had access to the Sang Primus Portum, a device containing pure genetic samples from all 20 Primarchs, including those who had turned traitor. This gave him material to work with that was closer to the source than any gene seed that had been passed down through the generations. He could see how the Emperor had originally designed the Primarchs, could understand the principles behind the gene seeds, creation in ways that had been lost over the millennia. And he used that knowledge to refine and improve upon the Emperor's work, creating enhanced gene seed that was more resistant to mutation and degradation. The 3 new organs that Primaris Marines possess are the sinew coils, which reinforce the tendons and ligaments to handle their increased strength, the Magnificat, which is half of the Immortis gland that the Emperor had created for the Primarchs themselves, and the Belisarian furnace, which can flood the body with combat stimulants when needed. Together with enhanced versions of the original 19 organs, these modifications make Primaris Marines noticeably superior to their firstborn brothers, standing nearly a foot taller and significantly stronger. But the introduction of Primaris Marines has not been without controversy. Some chapters view them with suspicion, seeing them as a replacement for the firstborn rather than a supplement. The process of converting existing Space Marines into Primaris through the Rubicon. Primaris procedure is extremely dangerous, with significant mortality rates, even among warriors who have survived centuries of warfare. And there are philosophical questions about whether the Emperor would have approved of these enhancements, whether they represent an improvement upon his vision or a deviation from it. Guilliman has insisted that Primaris Marines are necessary for the Imperium's survival, that the threats facing humanity in the Dark Imperium are so severe that every advantage must be seized. And so the chapters adapt, accepting Primaris reinforcements, undergoing the Rubicon Primaris when they dare, slowly transitioning toward a future where all Space Marines might be Primaris. But the change is not without cost, not without controversy, not without the sense that something fundamental is being lost, even as something powerful is being gained. Looking back across the millennia, from the Thunder Warriors who first marched beneath the Emperor's banner to the Primaris Marines who now defend the Imperium in its darkest hour, we can trace a line of continuous development. Each iteration built upon what came before, learning from past mistakes, refining techniques, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. The Emperor's work in those gene laboratories deep beneath the palace was the beginning of a process that continues to this day, a process of transforming humans into something more, something capable of standing against the horrors of the galaxy and refusing to yield. The Space Marines are the Emperor's greatest creation and his most terrible one. They are angels and monsters, saviors and killers, the last hope of humanity, and a constant reminder of how far humanity has fallen, that such warriors are necessary. They embody everything the Emperor dreamed of, and everything he failed to anticipate. They are proof that genius and vision can achieve the impossible, and proof that even the impossible comes with a price that must be paid. In the gene seed that flows through every Space Marine's veins, in the 19 organs that reshape human flesh into something more than human, in the psychological conditioning that turns boys into warriors who know no fear, we see the Emperor's hand at work. We see his understanding of genetics and biology, his willingness to experiment and iterate, his determination to create the tools humanity needed to survive, even if creating those tools required choices that would haunt the Imperium forever. We see a being who was willing to sacrifice the Thunder Warriors he had created, to scatter his own sons across the galaxy, to transform countless young men into weapons of war, all in service of a vision that he believed was worth any price. And perhaps it was. Perhaps the Emperor, for all his flaws and all the suffering his choices caused, truly did create the only thing that could save humanity from extinction. The Space Marines have held the Imperium together for 10,000 years since the Emperor's internment on the Golden Throne. They have faced Xeno's invasions that would have destroyed lesser civilizations. They have fought against the forces of chaos, emerging from the warp to corrupt and destroy. They have been the shield that stands between humanity and the darkness. Without them, the Imperium would have fallen millennia ago. With them, humanity endures, battered and broken perhaps, but alive and still fighting. The story of how the Emperor created Space Marines is not a simple tale of scientific triumph. It is a story of necessity and sacrifice, of brilliant innovation and terrible compromise, of vision pursued with single-minded determination regardless of cost. It is a story that began in the ruins of the Age of Strife, when a being older than any living civilization decided that the time had come to save humanity from itself. It is a story that continues in the closing years of the 41st Millennium, as new generations of Space Marines are created using methods 10,000 years old, as ancient gene seed is carefully harvested and implanted into young aspirants who will become the next defenders of the Imperium. And it is a story that reminds us that in the grim darkness of the far future, even the greatest victories come at a price. The Emperor created warriors who could fight the galaxy's nightmares and emerge victorious. But he also created warriors who would one day turn against him, who would shatter his Imperium in the greatest civil war humanity had ever known, who would serve as a constant reminder that power and loyalty are not the same thing. He created a process that could transform humans into demigods, but he could not guarantee that those demigods would remain human in the ways that mattered most. The Space Marines exist because humanity needed them. They are what we became when we faced extinction and refused to accept it. They are the price we paid for survival, the transformation we underwent to endure in a galaxy that wants nothing more than to destroy us. And as long as the Imperium stands, as long as there are young men willing to undergo the transformation, as long as gene seed can be harvested from the fallen and implanted into the living, the Emperor's greatest work will continue. The Space Marines will march to war beneath their chapter banners, will chant their battle prayers, will face impossible odds with the certainty that they were created for exactly this purpose. They are the Emperor's angels of death, and they are all that stands between humanity and the void. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the creation of the Space Marines and the Emperor's vision for humanity's defenders, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There's so much more to explore in the vast lore of Warhammer 40K, from the individual Primarchs and their legions to the dark secrets of the Horus heresy, from the evolution of Space Marine tactics over 10 millennia to the newest developments in the era Indomitus. Each topic reveals another layer of this incredible setting, another piece of the story that has captivated fans for decades. Join us as we continue to uncover the grim darkness of the far future, one video at a time. The Emperor protects, and knowledge is power. Until next time, may you walk in the light of the Astronomicon.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.